The creation of the United Nations was only one part of a much larger American vision for the post-war world. American leaders had concluded that military victory alone would not guarantee peace. They believed that the economic chaos of the 1930s had helped create the conditions that allowed fascist movements to rise across Europe. If another global conflict was to be prevented, the world would need institutions capable of maintaining both political stability and economic prosperity. Even before World War II had ended, delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new international financial system. Their goal was simple but ambitious: create a framework that would prevent another Great Depression and reduce the chances of another catastrophic war. The resulting Bretton Woods Agreement established institutions that still shape the global economy today, including the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Together, these organizations became pillars of a new international order. Under this system, the United States assumed a role unlike any nation had played before. It was no longer merely one powerful country among many. It had become the principal architect and guarantor of a global system designed to promote stability, trade, and development. Yet not everyone shared America's vision for the future. The Soviet Union emerged from World War II as the second most powerful nation on Earth. Although the United States and the Soviet Union had fought together against Nazi Germany, their alliance had always been one of necessity rather than friendship. The ideological differences between them were profound. The United States championed democracy, capitalism, and free markets. The Soviet Union promoted communism, centralized planning, and one-party rule. As Soviet influence expanded across Eastern Europe after the war, American policymakers grew increasingly concerned. They feared that Moscow intended to spread its model across the globe. In Washington's view, Soviet expansion threatened not only American interests but the entire international order that the United States was trying to build. This growing rivalry soon evolved into what became known as the Cold War. Unlike previous great power conflicts, the Cold War was rarely fought through direct military confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations possessed enormous military forces, and after 1949 both possessed nuclear weapons. A direct war between them risked the destruction of civilization itself. Instead, the struggle unfolded through proxy wars, espionage, political influence, economic competition, and technological rivalry. Each side sought to expand its influence while preventing the other from gaining ground. The stakes were enormous. Leaders in both Washington and Moscow believed that the future of the world depended on the success of their respective systems. To counter Soviet influence in Europe, the United States joined with several Western European nations to create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. This military alliance established a revolutionary principle: an attack against one member would be considered an attack against all members. NATO represented a dramatic shift in American foreign policy. For much of its history, the United States had avoided permanent military alliances. Now it was committing itself to the defense of nations thousands of miles away. Similar commitments emerged elsewhere. In Asia, America strengthened its partnerships with Japan and South Korea. In the Middle East, it cultivated relationships with countries such as Saudi Arabia and Israel. What began as a strategy to contain Soviet power gradually evolved into a vast network of global alliances. Containment became the guiding principle of American foreign policy throughout the Cold War. The idea was straightforward. Wherever communism attempted to spread, the United States would work to stop it. Sometimes this involved economic assistance. The Marshall Plan, for example, provided billions of dollars to rebuild Western Europe after the war, helping to prevent economic instability that might encourage communist movements. At other times, containment involved military intervention. American troops fought in Korea during the 1950s and later in Vietnam during the 1960s and 1970s. Both conflicts were driven by the belief that communist victories in one country could trigger similar developments elsewhere, a concept known as the domino theory. Beyond these highly visible wars, the the United States became involved in countless other struggles around the globe. American intelligence agencies conducted covert operations in countries ranging from Iran and Guatemala to Chile and the Congo. In some cases, Washington supported governments that shared its anti-communist goals, even when those governments were authoritarian. In others, it provided weapons, funding, and training to insurgent groups fighting Soviet-backed regimes. Afghanistan became one of the most significant examples. Following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the United States funneled support to resistance fighters seeking to drive Soviet forces from the country. Similar efforts occurred in Nicaragua during the 1980s. By the end of the Cold War, American influence extended into nearly every region of the world. This global strategy required enormous resources. The United States maintained military bases across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. Aircraft carriers patrolled the world's oceans. Intelligence networks operated on every continent. At home, military spending became a permanent feature of government policy. The military-industrial complex, a term popularized by President Dwight Eisenhower, became deeply embedded within American society. Entire industries, research institutions, and communities became linked to national defense. The Cold War transformed not only America's role abroad but also its economy and politics at home. For decades, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union defined international affairs. The world lived under the constant shadow of nuclear war. Crises such as the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought humanity dangerously close to catastrophe. Yet despite these tensions, neither superpower was willing to risk direct conflict. Instead, they competed in other arenas. The space race became a symbolic contest for technological superiority. Economic performance became a measure of ideological success. Cultural influence, scientific achievement, and diplomatic relationships all became battlegrounds in the broader struggle for global influence. By the 1980s, however, cracks were beginning to appear within the Soviet system. Economic stagnation, political inefficiency, and mounting military costs weakened the Soviet Union's ability to compete with the United States. Reform efforts initiated by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev unintentionally accelerated the system's collapse. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, symbolizing the end of communist rule across much of Eastern Europe. 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. The Cold War was over. The collapse of the Soviet Union left the United States in an unprecedented position. For the first time in modern history, a single nation stood without a serious rival. Many observers referred to this period as the unipolar moment. America possessed the world's largest economy, most powerful military, strongest alliances, and greatest cultural influence. At this point, the United States faced an important decision. It could reduce its global commitments and return to a more traditional foreign policy focused primarily on its own hemisphere. Alternatively, it could continue leading the international system it had spent decades constructing. American leaders chose the latter course. Rather than dismantling Cold War institutions, they expanded them. NATO not only survived the Soviet Union's collapse but grew larger, incorporating former communist states into the alliance. American military bases remained active across the globe. The United States continued supporting allies in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. International organizations such as the United Nations, World Bank, and IMF remained central components of the global system. Washington increasingly viewed itself as the guarantor of international stability. The post-Cold War era brought new challenges. Without the Soviet Union as a common enemy, ethnic conflicts and regional disputes gained greater prominence. American forces intervened in the Balkans during the 1990s to halt violence in Bosnia and Kosovo. Then, on September 11, 2001, the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington fundamentally altered American priorities. The United States launched the War on Terror, invading Afghanistan to destroy al-Qaeda and later invading Iraq in 2003. These conflicts would become some of the longest and most controversial military engagements in American history. At the same time, globalization accelerated. International trade expanded dramatically. Advances in communication and transportation connected economies more closely than ever before. American companies became global giants. The U.S. dollar remained the dominant international currency. Silicon Valley helped drive the digital revolution, giving American technology firms enormous influence over global communication, commerce, and culture. Even as military power remained important, economic and technological leadership became equally significant components of American influence. Yet the American-led international order also faced growing criticism. Some argued that U.S. interventions created instability rather than preventing it. Others questioned whether maintaining hundreds of overseas military installations and extensive alliance commitments remained sustainable. The rise of China introduced a new challenge. Unlike the Soviet Union, China combined authoritarian governance with deep integration into the global economy. Its rapid economic growth and expanding military capabilities positioned it as America's most significant strategic competitor in decades. These developments fueled debates within the United States about its future role in the world. Should America continue acting as the primary guarantor of international security? Should it maintain its extensive network of alliances? Or should it focus more narrowly on domestic concerns? These questions became increasingly prominent during the presidency of Donald Trump. Trump criticized long-standing alliances, questioned free trade agreements, and argued that American allies should bear more responsibility for their own defense. While many of the institutions created after World War II remained intact, his presidency demonstrated that the post-war consensus was no longer universally accepted. Today, the United States remains the most influential nation in the international system. Its military capabilities are unmatched. Its economy remains one of the largest and most innovative in the world. Its alliances span the globe. Yet the challenges it faces are different from those of the 20th century. Competition with China, technological disruption, cyber warfare, climate change, and shifting geopolitical dynamics are reshaping the international landscape. The question is no longer whether America will remain powerful. The question is how it will use that power in a world that is becoming increasingly complex and multipolar. More than 2 centuries after its founding, the United States continues to occupy a unique position in world affairs. From a collection of former colonies on the edge of the Atlantic to the architect of a global order, its rise has transformed the course of human history. Whether that order endures, evolves, or eventually gives way to something entirely new will help determine the future of the 21st century.